Hello everybody and welcome back to the Charlian Forum. My name is Chris and today I wanted to do something a little bit different where I'm going to talk about something that's been a big topic of discussion in the 14 community lately, and that is job identity and what that means for the game going forward. So we've seen in various interviews the team at Creative Business Unit 3, or whatever they're called now, they keep changing the name, has talked about 8.0 and job identity being a large focus for them and sort of where we're going in terms of how these jobs are going to be treated. What we can expect for these jobs going forward is a little bit nebulous. And, we won't know until we know, right? Until they tell us. But what we can do is we can speculate, right? And sort of talk about what we might like to see these jobs have in the future, what direction we might like to see them move in. So in front of me here, I have just sort of a short few bullet points about each job. Just to give some context, I do have all jobs at max level. I do play all jobs at least at a satisfactory level. I'm certainly not a great player of a lot of these jobs, but I understand how each of them functions at a level that I feel confident I can at least talk about them. I do tend to main melee DPS. That is sort of my main role. So I have a lot more insight on jobs, like how those jobs function and sort of what I would like to see more from them. With tanking probably being like my next best role in terms of what I understand. And then healing and ranged DPS, both caster and physical, I understand them, like I said, but I definitely don't have a super strong opinion on them outside of just a couple of cases. So let's just jump right in here. I sort of set this list up as like a overall commentary on the role itself, and then sort of each job, talking about it a little bit more in depth. So for melee DPS, I do believe that generally melee DPS are in a pretty good spot right now, just in terms of the gameplay experience of these jobs. However, the jobs sort of lack what I would call sauce, or swag, or just like a little something on top that just makes them feel a little bit more distinct, a little bit more interesting, a little bit more thematic. Some of them do better than others in that regard, but I would say that all of them could have just a little bit of extra sauce on top that would sort of give them a little bit more oomph, just in terms of their design. I think gameplay wise, like moment to moment gameplay, all of the melee jobs are very strong right now. They all feel great to play. Some of them just feel like they're missing something, right? So I think that adding some quality of life and just like some flavor to these jobs would probably fix like 99% of the issues that they have. And I think that a good way to do this would be to create additional reward states. And what I mean by that is take interactions that already exist in the game right now in these jobs and just sort of give them some additional stuff. We don't really need to like cut anything and add a bunch of crazy stuff to any of these jobs. I really think that just having some more interactions and some more rewards for doing things certain ways would sort of benefit all of the melee jobs quite a bit. So let's start with Viper. It's the newest job, so it's also kind of the hardest to see like where it's going, right? Because we don't have any context for like how it's evolved, right? All these other jobs, we sort of understand how they're building up from expansion to expansion as our level cap goes up, how these jobs are growing, right? But Viper, obviously we only have it at level 100. That's the only place we've seen it. That's the only context we know it in. So it's a little harder to sort of understand fully where they're going. But I think that the main thing that Viper needs is just some kind of additional mechanic on top of the kit that it already has now. So right now we have the Reawaken loop, then we have our sort of back and forth trading combos. We have our OGCD dual blade attacks with the back and forth enhancements that those do. It's a good gameplay loop, but it just feels like there's something missing. Like there's another layer that needs to be placed on top of Viper to give it just like a little bit more pizzazz, to make it a little bit more interesting to play. And I think that a really good idea that could fit in here really well is to revitalize and to bring back the poison system that Ninja used to have. Ninja used to have 2 poisons that would add an additional effect to Mug. But I do think that it would be really interesting for Viper to have 2 or 3 different poisons, or some kind of like stance system that it could sort of switch out. And, you know, a really easy place for them to add some sort of interaction with that would be Death Rattle, your OGCD. So this occurs after every single combo that we do. Death Rattle comes out, right? So it would be a really interesting place to have, you know, like maybe we have a stance where every time we Death Rattle, we put a dot on the enemy, and we have to maintain that dot by moving through our combos and Death Rattling, right? And maybe we have a stance that every time we Death Rattle, we heal ourselves. Maybe we have a stance where every time we Death Rattle, we generate a shield for ourselves. You know, there's a lot of interesting things that they could do where you have this sort of, Viper already has this sort of looping cyclical nature where you're moving through these things in an order. So having a payoff at the end of this would just be very thematic. And I think that having different effects for different postures or stances or poison levels or whatever we want to call it, would just have a really cool way to sort of give Viper an additional thing to think about. You know, what stance am I in? Is it going to be beneficial when I Death Rattle, or is it just going to be wasted, right? That would be a very interesting, just extra layer of management for Viper. I think that another thing, the Viper job gauge is like genuinely terrible. I really think that it needs to be revamped. It's very unclear like what it's actually trying to say. The fact that our colors don't match up with our combo colors doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. It just seems like a dumb choice. And I think that the sound cues on Viper are like generally kind of weak. I think that we need better sound cues for when we hit 50 gauge. We need better sound cues for if we hit 100 gauge, unfortunately. And we need better sound cues for when we hit 3 coils. Those 3 things I think need very distinct and clear sound cues that make it obvious what just happened and how I need to react to those cues, right? This job also still really needs a defensive cooldown. I'd also really like to see parity in the AoE and single target rotation, kind of like Dancer has, where you can sort of seamlessly flow between them. You know, this has never been like a huge issue that it's not present, but doing M6S with the ads phase, it makes it very apparent when you have to like switch back and forth between them. And like, if you initiate, you know, your Vice Winder as a single target, you are locked into single target. You cannot use the AoE follow-ups or the AoE OGCDs. And I think that it feels pretty bad when we have a fight that sort of focuses heavily on, we need to prioritize this target. You know, for the first section, I only want to hit the Yan, but then eventually I'm going to have to switch back. And like, if the Yan dies in the middle of my Vice Winder combo, then it's like, oh, well, I'm locked into this now and I'm stuck with this. So I guess I'm just going to have to focus one thing when I really should be cleaving. So it's just a little bit cumbersome to not have that parity across the combos. So I'd really like to see that. So moving on to Ninja. I think that the first thing I always think about on Ninja is why do we have 2 Raijus? I think that it's a little silly to have 2 skills that like functionally do the same thing. One is just a gap closer and one isn't. I think that you would be better off just combining these 2 to free up a button. You can just reduce the animation lock on this, keep the gap closer, and just make it 1 skill, right? You know, and to sort of skip ahead a little bit, like just make Shikuchi a targeted dash. I think the ground targeting thing is like kind of tired and old. Thunderclap and Slither both function like this, where you can target a player or a boss and you can just slide to them. This is just objectively a better way to handle skills like this. It's the way the majority of the player base uses the skill anyway, because they just macro it to automatically put them in the center of the target box. You know, there is limited usefulness where you can find a reason to use Shikuchi as a ground targeted to like get you into a very specific spot for ground AoEs or something. But I just feel like that's not a very good reason to like have this skill feel clunky. I would also love to see, as a geriatric Final Fantasy XI player, I would love to see Shade Shift kind of be changed. Right now, Shade Shift just gives a flat damage reduction for 20 seconds, which is really strong. But I think it would be much more thematic and cool and just like have a lot of identity, again, that like sauce, to give Shade Shift to harken back to Utsusimi spells in Final Fantasy XI. So Ninja in Final Fantasy XI had these spells called Utsusimi, Ichi, Ni, and San, 1, 2, and 3, that when you cast it, it would give you shadow images, which anytime you took a hit, a shadow would absorb the hit and you would take no damage and the shadow would disappear, right? It's Shadow Clone Jutsu from Naruto, right? But Shade Shift kind of like alludes to that in its description, but it's just a damage reduction for 20 seconds. I think what would be way more interesting is if when you hit Shade Shift, you got 6 stacks of a buff called Utsusimi or something, and anytime you took a hit, one of those stacks would disappear and you would just take reduced damage. You know, you could, oh, well, anytime a shadow takes a hit for you, you take 20% less damage from that hit and one stack falls off, right? So it doesn't like ultimately decrease the utility of the skill, but it adds a lot of thematic sauce to it. I also really want something else to use the Kaze Matoi gauge right now. I feel like it just being a sticker that adds potency to Aeolian Edge is like a little bit lame. It's fine, right? Like it's functional and it's makes you switch back and forth in your combos, but I think that there needs to be another ability that uses this. It could even be a really interesting way to like make Utsusimi a thing. So like maybe Shade Shift stays the way it is, but we add Utsusimi as an ability in, and like for every Kaze Matoi you have, you can hit Utsusimi and it'll give you a stack of that damage reduction per Kaze Matoi it consumes, right? So like you can choose to sacrifice offense for defense if you feel like you need it. Interactions like that, I think, are like where this game could really add a ton of flavor and a ton of identity to these jobs without having to like dramatically change the way that they function. So I'd love to see something like that. And similarly, moving on to Samurai, similarly, you know, Third Eye used to be a really, really flavorful skill, right? Because it was an ability that you hit as a reactionary defensive. I know that I'm about to take a hit, so I'm going to activate Third Eye. And when I get hit, it consumes the Third Eye debuff, or it consumes the Third Eye buff, rather, and it gives me 2 options. It gives me the option to heal myself with Merciful Eyes, or it gives me the option to retaliate with Hisatsu Saigen. And this was like a very, very satisfying and very cool loop for Samurai to have, where you were rewarded for correctly predicting what was about to happen, right? And that is an interaction that no longer exists, right? Because now you have Tengensu, which is an amazing skill. It's very powerful, but it's basically just like, I know I'm about to get hit, so I just activate this thing, I take less damage, and I get healed. And that's fine, it's cool, but it was cooler when I could choose whether I wanted to get healed or I wanted to take advantage of that prediction and deal like extra damage. So I would love to see Hisatsu Saigen and Merciful Eyes make a return. I think that this system was just better because anything that gives the players more choice in how they are rewarded for something is always better. You know, we can talk we can talk a lot about Kaiten and its removal. You know, it's been a couple years now since Kaiten was removed. We have to move on. Kaiten is never coming back. but we could have something that gives us a similar feeling, right? I think that, and I've thought about this a lot over the years since chitin has been removed. I think that the biggest thing that we are now missing since chitin's removal is that we do not have an interaction between Kinki, our resource, and Sin, our stickers, right? That interaction, other than Hagakure, but that interaction is a space that now has nothing in it. You know, chitin was that interaction. You would spend Kinki to enhance your Sin. And then you had Hagakure as sort of an inverse, where you would consume your Sin to enhance your Kinki. You had this sort of back and forth of these two abilities that let you choose how you wanted those two meters to interact. And now that chitin is gone, we do not have that. So I don't really advocate for chitin to be re-added. I think that it was just a button that you had to press before you pressed another button. It's not a particularly interesting skill, but what could be cool is something that just fills that gap, right? It fills that space. So what if we had like the inverse of Hagakure, where if instead of consuming Sin to boost Kinki, we had a button that consumed our Kinki to fill a random unfilled Sin. So this could be like a really cool downtime tool, where if you had a bunch of Kinki and you know that you want to like get back on the boss and just hit it with a Madare like right away, you can use this. You could, you know, interact with Meditate, because you're going to build Kinki with Meditate, and then you can dump Kinki directly into your Sin. And you could do it like every 30 Kinki you sacrifice fills one Sin that's, you know, not filled. So if you sacrifice 90, you get 3 full Sin, and then you can just blow it up immediately. Now the implications of the damage there could be something that would have to be worked out, because now we get a free Keishi at the end of each Iaijutsu, so like, you know, that could be a little bit troublesome, but I just think that there needs to be something that fills that void of where those two meters interact. My biggest nitpick on Samurai right now is the Zanshin. It's the new level 100 ability. It's the front flip with the big cone. I just think that that needs to be reworked, like the VFX or the sound or something. Samurai is like the big boom, I hit the button and it explodes job. And this level 100 ability has like no impact. It feels like you're doing a front flip with like a pool noodle in your hand. It just has like no impact at all. And I would really like to see that just get a pass, just something, just add like some screen shake or like a bigger boom, just some kind of VFX update, visual or sound effects that just give it something, right? Just a little more oomph. For Monk, this might be sort of a hot take, but I think that current Monk is probably my favorite version of Monk that we've ever had. I think that like the builder spender ball enhancement, naughty back and forth perfect balance thing is like a very fun, very complete feeling version of Monk. I think that, you know, we had the combos with Monk, we had Nadi, you know, they added that in with the perfect balance, where you're using these different combinations to create a payoff at the end, and that's like a very good core system. And I think that adding the I forget, the Fury gauge, I think is the official name for it, the balls, adding the balls, that is like a really good example of adding an additional layer to a job that doesn't dramatically change its feeling, its gameplay, but it adds like another thing to manage, right? That's a very good example of that. So I don't have a lot to say about Monk. I think it's actually in a very good place. If I have to complain about something about Monk, it would probably be the order the AoE skills are learned in. It's very dumb that it's still the way that it is. The fact that you have to like AoE, single target AoE in certain situations is really stupid. I just don't really know why that's the case. It probably just needs to be changed so that you learn your AoEs in stance order. And some people really love the idea of a ranged filler GCD on Monk. I don't know. I don't know that it fits really, like very thematically. You know, you have Six-Sided Star as a tool that's meant to like mitigate the need for that because you hit this big potency attack right before you disengage, and then you have this longer GCD that you're enforced with to sort of compensate for that. And I think that that's like a much more thematic and interesting system, but it could work. Like a monk could have a ranged filler GCD if it was the right ability and it had the right effects. So I don't know. We'll see. Reaper. I think Reaper definitely needs some love. I think that the main issue with Reaper right now is that it's gauge negative, right? That just doesn't feel very good. Gauge negative just kind of sucks, especially when you compare it to something like Viper, which is a job that's like ostensibly sort of similar to Reaper in a lot of ways, but Viper is gauge positive. So Reaper actually loses, quote unquote, 20 soul every 2 minutes, whereas Viper gains. I think if you just combo straight up with Viper, you will gain 70 gauge every 1 minute. So you are gaining 20 gauge on Viper every minute versus losing 20 on Reaper every 2 minutes. So it's just like, it's a little strange. When you're comparing it to a job that's similar, it's like very clear how much this one suffers. So I would just love to see that changed. Solso, I think, is like a cool ability, but it needs to do something a little more interesting. I think that Harvest is like a fun button to press, but it's not a cool enough or like an impactful enough button to be the only benefit that Reaper gets out of downtime. I don't know. I mean, it would be cool if like Solso was a channeled ability, kind of like Meditate, where like the longer I held it, the more gauge I got. And then at the end, if I held it for a certain amount of time, when I cancel it, I get Harvest as a benefit, right? So sort of like a mix between like Dancer improvisation and Meditate from Samurai. Just a little more reason to press it, I think would be cool. Harp, I think, should be instant cast. I really don't like that Harp has a cast time. It feels bad to use. It feels very clunky. And I know that the idea is to use ingress and egress as like a way to make it instant. But I don't know. I just think it's like, if a fight requires a lot of movement and you have to back off for that movement for any reason, it feels really terrible to not be able to hit a Harp more than once. So I don't know. I'd also love to see Enshroud have its cooldown reduced. Double Enshroud windows feel unbelievably tight because of the fact that the cooldown on Enshroud is longer than it takes to move through the entirety of the Enshroud phase. So again, like when you compare it to Viper, Reawaken is up again by the time you come out of Reawaken. Like by the time you hit Ouroboros to end Reawaken, you can almost immediately Reawaken right away. You just have to wait for the GCD to finish spinning, right? Whereas Reaper, you come out of Enshroud and you have like 5 or 6 seconds where you just have to sit there and do other stuff to fill in for this space where you can't go back into Enshroud again. And I think that that's just like a little lame. It makes double Enshroud windows feel very sluggish. Reaper just feels like really slow to me, which I know the idea is that Reaper's supposed to be like this sort of calculated build up and spend it all at once. But the other side of it is that Reawaken, or not Reawaken, see, there I go. Enshroud is designed to be like a fast phase. Like you have this very slow, heavy job that you hit Enshroud and all of a sudden you're this demon possessed and you just move through this combo super fast. But the part that sucks is that you come out of it and you're like, I want to do that again. You know, I have the gauge to do that again. Let me go right now. I want to go, 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 go. But instead the game puts a stop sign in front of you for 5 or 6 seconds and you have to just sit there and wait. So you don't get that feeling of being fast. And it just feels not very good to play. It might make sense gameplay wise in terms of like numbers, but the feeling of Reaper, I think, is just suffering quite a bit right now. Death's Design, I still fucking hate Death's Design. Sorry, that skill sucks. Figure out something else. Dragoon. I think that Dragoon, number one issue for me is that AoE is still level 40 on Dragoon, which is just like insane. That feels terrible to play Dragoon in level sync scenarios because you just don't have any AoE buttons, and it just feels bad, man. My, freezing cold take is that every single job in this game should get their first AoE button at level 15 so that you can go into the first dungeon with an AoE attack. Every single job should have an AoE button at level 15. All of them. The fact that that is not the case is stupid, and I just think it needs to be changed. Life Surge is still dumb. I don't like Life Surge. I think that Life Surge needs to just be removed. It's like Chitin, but like even worse and somehow even less interesting than Chitin was. It's just like not a fun skill to press. It does nothing for me. It kind of just sucks. The new interaction between Elusive Jump and Piercing Talon is really, really cool, but it could be cooler, right? So right now we have this system where when I backflip with Elusive Jump, it upgrades my Piercing Talon. This is a very similar system to a lot of other melee DPS have this. Samurai has this, Reaper has this. But what would be interesting to me, and I think like really easy brownie points with fan service, would be that when you Elusive Jump and you get Enhanced Piercing Talon, instead of it just being Enhanced Piercing Talon, it transforms into a different skill. And you could choose anything for this, but like the thing that came to my mind again as an 11 player was Angon, which was an ability that Dragoons had where you would throw a spear that you had to have equipped in your inventory. That gave some effects, but it was a really interesting and like very niche skill, but it was powerful and it was useful and when it was useful. But you could easily have Elusive Jump transform Piercing Talon into Angon, and then when you press Angon, you get a buff. And what that buff does is, while you have it, it transforms Winged Glide, their new gap closer, into Spine Shatter Dive. So you could bring back this ability that people really like, without giving more clutter in the burst, because that was the reason Spine Shatter Dive was removed. It's a lot like Gunbreaker and Dark Knight having their potencies removed from their gap closers. It's not because they don't want potency on gap closer, it's because you end up having these really busy burst windows where you also have to work in these other gap closer abilities, because otherwise you're losing potency, right? So having it connected to this very specific thing where I backflip out, I throw my ranged attack, and for, correctly engaging with this loop of disengage and re-engage, I get the benefit of my gap closer, which is normally just a gap closer with no damage, now deals damage when I press it. And that's like what I mean when I say, having new rewards integrated into these loops that already exist in the game, these systems that could be improved by giving the player additional agency. This is the type of thing I'm talking about. You get a reward for correctly engaging in this loop of backflip, ranged attack, gap closer, because that is the intended function, right? It's why Samurai they have their disengage. When they disengage, they get an enhanced version of their ranged attack. When they hit that, they get 10 gauge, which is conveniently the exact number of gauge you need to use your gap closer, right? You get this very complete loop of engaging with this system correctly, and I am rewarded. Dragoon does not have that. I think that would benefit this job a lot. Just little things like that. Another thing, Dragoon still feels kind of weird to play sometimes. I sort of feel like my inputs get eaten on Dragoon a lot. And what I mean by that is, like I will press a button and then I like don't think anything happened, and then what feels like a whole second later, the attack will go off. And this is like, it's very, the skills that I think are like the most, you know, responsible for this are, like Dragonfire Dive, the new, I forget what the follow-up to that is called, but the new Nidhogg thing, and then Starcross, I think they feel like the animation for them is like capturing me, and I can't do something, and like I hit a button while that animation is happening, but it doesn't happen, so I'm like muscle memory moving on to something else, and then the first thing that I pressed happens. And so it kind of like throws my brain for a loop where I'm like, what is going on? So I just feel like that needs to get changed. Just something about it doesn't feel right. Okay, so moving on to physical range DPS. Physical range DPS, I think right now is probably the role that's suffering the most. Just like anecdotally, it just feels like nobody wants to play this role right now. And if they do, they basically only want to play Dancer. So I don't know. I think that there's just something going on with this role that just needs to be examined. But it's also worth noting that this is the role with the most likely candidacy to receive a new job in 8.0. If they only do one job in 8.0, it will almost certainly be a Phys ranged. If they do two jobs, it will probably be a Phys ranged and a tank. Those are my assumptions. But I do think that having a new job in the role will probably inject a lot of life into it, but it just feels like right now there's this really big power imbalance in the Phys range role, and it creates this really strange scenario where people really only want to engage with it in a certain way. So something a note I made here is that like the supportive versus selfish nature of DPS is not happening effectively in this role. And the main reason for that is that Machinist is just very underpowered, right? But we'll start with Dancer because I feel like Dancer is sort of the one that everybody knows the most about. It's the one that most people play if they're going to play this role. Talana is like still stupid. You know, they changed in Dawntrail basically all jobs that had a button that gave them gauge. It now just lets them use whatever the big thing for gauge was for free instead. But for some reason they didn't do that for Talana. It still gives 50 Esprit, which feels terrible because if you like don't, you know, the burst for Dancer is very tight. You have to fit a lot of stuff in. And so if you Talana and you didn't Saber Dance beforehand for whatever reason, you're just going to overcap. You're going to eat gauge, and there's nothing you can do about it. This is just like bad design. They fixed it with all the other jobs, but for some reason they didn't fix it with this, and I don't really get it. So that just needs to be changed. You know, at times I think that, you know, when you go into your burst, like you come out of tech and you hit Devilment and you hit Flourish and you know, you look at how many things are lit up and it's just like, oh my God, like my whole bar is lit up right now. So it can be a little bit overwhelming, but I think that that's also what makes the job fun because you kind of get this feeling of like, I can just press anything, you know, and I'm going to do damage, which is a really cool feeling, but I can understand why it might be really overwhelming. So I think that condensing things like very slightly, I mean like one button or two buttons at max, could be a way of just sort of helping reduce that like overwhelming feeling. And this could be as simple as just like remove one proc from something or just like make the spacing of things a little different. Because right now the benefit of hitting everything all at once and just having every button on your bar light up is too much damage to ignore. So giving the job a reason to maybe wait to press one of those buttons might be beneficial. And proc-based gameplay isn't everyone's favorite. I think that that's like a non-issue, but I wanted to put it in here because I hear that complaint a lot, but I don't know. I mean, if you don't want procs, you can play the other ranged. I think that having a proc-based class in each role is like a good thing to have. For Bard, I feel like the dots don't really have an effect on the gameplay anymore. yes, they have the a 35% chance or whatever it is to grant Hawk's Eye, whatever that buff is called. I think it's Hawk's Eye now. But you know, you get that from hitting your regular filler attack. So I don't really think the dots just feel very vestigial to me. I think that the damage that those dots grant could easily be baked into the rest of the kit, and I don't think that the proc chance on them makes it worth it. I think that they either need to be removed or they need to be reworked to be a more integral and interactive part of the kit. You know, it used to be that your dots are what procced your songs. So, you know, when you had Mage's Ballad on something and you're getting your repertoire stacks, it used to be that your dots are what procced those, not just like random. I think now it's just a random chance, basically. And then you also have Empyrean Arrow to proc those manually. So I think that it just feels very vestigial. It feels very tacked on. If those were to change, I think that Iron Jaws would either need to be removed or be reworked into something a little bit more interesting. It would be cool if it interacted with the dots in like a more interesting way, if we are going to keep the dots on Bard. And I think that another thing that could benefit Bard a lot, because Bard's identity is sort of, you know, Dancer's identity is sort of, you pick one person in the party and you give them a ton of benefit, right? And then you give everybody else a little bit of benefit. Bard's identity is that you're giving everybody in the party a moderate amount of benefit, right? You're not really giving everybody, or you're not giving any one particular person as much benefit as Dancer does, but you're giving the party as a whole a higher level of benefit than Dancer would provide. So I think that leaning into that identity would be very cool for Bard. You know, it used to be like this a little bit. Mage's Ballad used to give like an MP refresh. And I think that we should maybe bring that back. Maybe make Mage's Ballad regenerate everybody's MP while it's active. You know, this doesn't have to be like a huge buff. I'm not talking about like, I don't need to ever worry about MP as a caster ever if I have a Bard in my party. But, you know, maybe like half of what, I forget the name of the spell now. Lucid Dreaming. Like half of what Lucid Dreaming does for casters, you get that for the duration of Mage's Ballad, right? Or even just make it 15 seconds. Like when you first initiate Mage's Ballad, you get 15 seconds of MP refresh. Just something like that would be cool. And you could do movement speed on the other ones, HP regen. You know, there's a lot of stuff that you could do to just give Bard this, again, this little extra sauce, right? Machinist. I think that Machinist just needs a rework at this point. I think that this job is just in a place where it seems like they can't fix it. Like no matter what they do with it, it just doesn't work. It's a shame because the single target flow of Machinist, like the feeling of playing the job, is very fun, but it just doesn't do enough damage. The value that Bard and Dancer bring to the group absolutely clears the damage benefit of having a Machinist. It's just not strong enough. Yes, the changes in 7.2 made their, you know, AoE damage better, but it didn't change the feeling of playing the job in AoE, which feels terrible because auto crossbow doesn't reduce the cooldown on double check and checkmate like the new heat blast. I forget what the new one is called, ignite shot or something. It doesn't reduce the cooldown on those like that skill does in single target, so it feels like you're almost punished for using auto crossbow, which is really strange. You know, they nerfed Scattershot, which is fine, but it's like we only have one AoE filler that like does anything, and you just took damage away from it. Flamethrower still sucks. It's still a meme. There's basically no reason to press it. I don't really think that Bioblaster like feels very good to press. There's just a lot of things about Bard or excuse me, Machinist AoE that The single target process of Machinist, the single target rotation feels incredible but doesn't do enough damage, and the AoE does enough damage but feels terrible to play. So they almost need to like combine forces here and make a job that actually feels good to play and does enough damage to make up for the fact that it doesn't bring any utility. And like the changes in 7.2, like I said, made the damage of the job better, but they didn't make the experience of playing Machinist feel any better. And I think that that is like ultimately the problem that Machinist has, is that it feels kind of bad to play in some scenarios, and in the scenarios where it does feel good to play, it doesn't do enough damage to make up for the fact that the two other jobs in its role are just vastly better at what they do. So Machinist is just like languishing right now. It's really unfortunate, but it just needs something to change. Moving on to casters, I think that caster is actually the role that probably needs like the least attention. I feel that the casters are all generally in a pretty good spot right now. That might be a hot take with the Black Mage changes, but I'll get there. I think that all 4 casters have like a very strong identity right now. They all feel very distinct. And they all feel pretty complete except for Summoner, which again, I'll get to. But my big concern with casters is, where do we go from here, right? I don't see the vision of where these jobs can go. So let's get into it a little bit. With Pictomancer, I think that Pictomancer is generally in a better place after the nerf. But I do think that the changes to the hammer motif are a little heavy-handed. It's now like so weak that using it for any reason outside of movement is like actively a loss, which I think is like bad, right? Bad, right? I think that's tough to say it's bad, because the purpose is for it to be a movement tool. That's fine. But the issue is that we've now taken the thing that made Pictomancer really cool and fun and unique to play, which is these motifs that it can use, and we've made one of them completely situational, which I think is bad. I think that is bad design. I don't think that hammer doing like not a ton of damage, considering it's so movement heavy, is like a bad idea. But I think that the fact that it made that entire slot of your motifs feel obsolete kind of outside of the instance where you need to move is a bad thing. So I would remedy this by adding another weapon, like a spear or an axe, or like something heavy, like a greatsword render, you know, something heavy that gives the mental feeling of like, if I'm going to wield this thing, I need to be stationary, right? And, you know, that could be sort of the flip-flop to hammer. So hammer has lower potency, but high movement. This thing could have low movement, but high potency, and it could have a cast time. You know, think of like, you know, Summoner kind of has this in like a weird way, where you have Ifrit. You know, you have Titan and Garuda are both like very movement focused. You can move very freely, but then when you switch to Ifrit, you are now locked. If I'm going to cast these 2 spells, I have to stand here. And that's like a cool thing, right? Like that's a fun interaction. And so it would be interesting for Pictomancer to have that same identity where, or not identity, but like that same sort of like ideation of concept where I render my weapon, or I paint my weapon motif, and then I look at the boss and I know I'm going to be able to stand still for this. So I'm going to hit my axe motif, my render axe, and I'm going to hit these 2 axe buttons that have a 3-second cast time or something and do a lot of damage. Or I can look at the boss and say, I'm about to have to move a lot. And so I'm going to hit hammer so that I can keep it moving, and I can at least deal some damage and have some potency while I'm moving with hammer. So just having an option there, I think, is key. I think the increased potency in the 1-2-3 combo feels good. I think that it makes Pictomancer feel less like a Phys ranged, because to me it sort of felt like I was just playing a Phys ranged. I was just using motifs and trying to cast my spells as little as possible. But now I feel more like a caster that can use these tools for reasons, whereas before it was like I just wanted to use my motifs before, and I just have to cast my spells in between. So I think that that's a good change overall, but I think that the hammer change is a tiny bit heavy-handed and just needs to be either dialed back slightly, or we need to have another option. Red Mage. I think that Red Mage right now has the strongest identity of any job in the game. It is very clear what Red Mage is about. You have dual cast, you have, you know, your melee combo and your magic combo. It's a job that feels very complete. It feels very unique. It feels like Red Mage, and it doesn't really feel like anything else. So I don't know that we should do a lot to it, right? I like that. I want to kind of leave Red Mage the way it is. But there are some things that I think, you know, just might help the game along a little bit, give more reasons for other jobs to do things. And I think that one of the things, unfortunately, that Red Mage should probably have on it is a cooldown on Verraise. I think that having the ability to chain raise people with basically zero downsides is just like a very, very strong ability to have. I would put a short cooldown on Verraise. It doesn't need to be crazy, like maybe 45 seconds, 60 seconds. Just like something that allows the skill to still be very impactful. Like I can still instant cast a raise on somebody without having to use swift cast. Like that's still really strong, and I can do that once a minute, but it lets the job like have a failure, right? Where if I use this raise like willy-nilly and then the person just dies again or something, now I don't have it. You know what I mean? So I need to think a little more about what I'm doing, as opposed to dead guy on party list, click raise button. You know, like I think that there just needs to be something some friction there that the job would benefit from. I do think that this might be the job that I have the most concerns about for 8.0 and beyond, because like, where do we go from here? You know, like, do we add another finisher? Do we add another melee attack? Like, what's happening? So I'm a little concerned about the future of this job. I think that more melee options might be like a fun, flavorful thing that they could add. I don't know, you know, a Red Mage is just in a spot where like it feels complete, but it also sort of feels like anything they do to it at this point is gonna harm it. So I don't know. Red Mage is one of the ones that I'm like very torn on. I'm very unsure of what that means for the job going forward. So this is going to be one of the jobs that I probably watch closest, just to see what's happening as we go into 8.0 and beyond. Okay, so moving on to Black Mage. This might be where I lose some people, and that's okay. But I think that the new Black Mage post 7.2 changes is good. I think that it feels like a sort of like a leveling off, a sort of like reset almost, to create space for other things to happen, right? And what I mean by that is like, as we move forward into 8.0, like what we see with jobs like Red Mage or jobs like Monk or Reaper, or even Viper to an extent, it's hard to imagine exactly what they're going to do. You know, like, is Monk going to get a third naughty that has some other combination? Like, I don't know. Is it going to get upgrades to its other combos now that it got upgrades to the one set? Is it going to get another charge of perfect balance? Is Reaper going to get Perfectierist, where you have another finisher on your finisher that's on your finisher? Is it going to get another stack of Enshroud to make the, like, there's things that they can do, but it feels like there's not a ton of room to grow. And I think that Black Mage was hitting that point. It was hitting the point at level 100 where I didn't know what else they could possibly do with it, right? Like, do we get Fire 5? Like, does Fire 4 upgrade, you know? Do we get another upgrade to a spell we're never going to press, like High Fire 2 and High Blizzard 2? Do we get another stack of Polyglot, another Foul, another Xeno? You know, what do we get at this point? There's not a lot that we can really do. And so I feel like these changes have sort of flattened the playing field a little bit. So now they can introduce stuff in 8.0 that there's space for, because the timing on a lot of the windows was so tight that there was no room to put anything else, right? So now we kind of have that room, because there's a little bit more flexibility in the job. You don't have to press things in quite the same order that you pressed them before. There are things that you can just skip. Like, you don't have to press Paradox anymore. So now they can do something with Paradox. You know, they can add something to it in 8.0 to make it a button that you press for a particular reason. So I think that that's sort of where they're going with this. You know, firing off Fire 4 is like a machine gun still feels really good. I think that the complete removal of all timers on the job is a little bit contentious. Obviously, that's kind of the thing that people complain about, is that it's now I don't have to think about any management. You know, the core rotation of the job hasn't really changed, but I don't have to think about managing any timers anymore, which I think for people that liked the feeling of like mastery that Black Mage gives them, where they move through these phases very effortlessly and without dropping any of these timers and everything refreshing perfectly, that feeling of mastery is what they now feel like they don't get out of it, right? So I think that we could add some timers back in. I don't think that Astral Fire and Umbral Ice are the answer. Let's be honest. Anybody who's playing Black Mage at any sort of level above like complete novice never had an issue maintaining these timers. They were just there so that if you messed up, then you got punished. Which, okay, I get it, you know, that's fine. But like, let's not pretend that anybody who's like Savage rating on a Black Mage ever dropped Umbral Fire, or Astral Fire rather, or Umbral Ice. That just doesn't happen. You know the job well enough at that point that you're not dropping those. So I don't know that that's really the answer, but you know, maybe adding timers back to Fire Starter and Thunderhead, or adding timers to something else, like have another ability that has a timer. I think those would be fine changes. I can understand the desire for Black Mage players who play Black Mage specifically for that feeling of mastery. I can understand the desire to see it return to its former state, but I also think that people react very negatively anytime Black Mage gets any changes, and it always ends up being okay, right? We always see this where a Black Mage change is announced. We see it in a live letter because that's what Yoshi P does. Everybody panics. It's absolute pandemonium and chaos, and everybody's like, the job's cooked, the game's over. Explosion goes on Twitter and talks about how everything is falling down and the sky is burning and the whole world is coming to an end. And then the patch releases, and 8 hours after, Explosion puts out a tweet that's like, LOL, here's a crazy non-standard line that somebody found, and it's actually like 3% more damage than we were doing before, so it's all good, you know? And that we've seen it over and over and over and over again every time Black Mage gets a change, and people still freak out. So I don't know. I'd like to just believe that this time is no different. It's going to be okay. They're going to find some way to make this, you know, feel better in the future. I think it feels fine now personally, but I understand where people are coming from with this, like, the job now does not have that same feeling of mastery. So I'd like to believe that they will find a way to inject that feeling of mastery back into the job. Summoner, this is like the easiest slam dunk of all time. The job needs to be reworked. I released a whole video on this not long ago, talking about the fact that Summoner, the main issue with Summoner right now is not that it's easy. You know, we're fine with easy jobs. The issue with Summoner is that it's boring, right? It's not interesting. It's very static. It moves through its rotation with like basically zero flexibility. And it's just, it's just not very interesting to play, right? Like that's the ultimate issue. The issue is not jobs being simple, the issue is jobs being boring. And so I would love to see what everybody else would love to see, which is the introduction of more primals into Summoner. I think that a really cool way to do this would be to sort of adopt a version of the Nadi system from Monks, where you have like an astral phase and an umbral phase, and when you hit your astral phase, you have the Ifrit, Shiva, and Garuda. You have the 3 astral elements, and when you come out of that, you get a little light up thing on your gauge that gives you 1 astral point. And then you have an umbral phase where you have Rama, Leviathan, and Titan, and when you come out of that, you have an umbral thing, and you can use either one. There's no rigidity there. If you want to do astral, you can. If you want to do umbral, you can. It just depends on what you're looking for in the fight. And maybe 2 umbrals summons Bahamut, 2 astrals summons Phoenix. A mix match gives you Solar Bahamut, and then have some big, like a grand summon or something where you just maybe after you cast Bahamut you get like an umbral ether, an additional stack of something. And if you have like 2 umbral ethers, you can call in Odin, and Odin does Zantetsuken. And if you have like 2 astral ethers, you call in Alexander and he does Divine Judgment. Or like if you have 1 of each, then you summon, I don't know, Siren or something. There's a million things that they could do to just give Summoner more stuff to look at, more stuff to think about, more things to move through, and just make it like a more interesting job to play without changing that core loop of enter summoning phase, exit summoning phase, filler, enter summoning phase, exit summoning phase, right? Because that loop is very easy to understand, very easy to gather in your brain and execute on, but giving the players who want to min-max the ability to move through these summoning phases a little bit more freely, and giving the primals more diverse benefits and more diverse skill packages would let players optimize this job in a way that gives a lot of excitement without making it any more difficult. So new players could still just astral 1 2 3, umbral on 1 2 3, big summon, move on, right? They don't have to optimize it. They can do that. It doesn't change the loop at all. But experienced players can know, I have to move a lot, I'm going to umbral, because maybe the umbral summons have way more movement than the astral summons do. So something like that would be just a really interesting system. And we have the Nadi system, we have this structure of doing things in a certain order and getting a reward, doing things in a different order, getting a different reward, and then executing an attack based on those rewards, right? That's what I think Summoner needs. So moving on to tanks now. Tanks, I think the biggest thing for all the tank role right now is that in casual content, tanks are just too strong. I think that if we reduce the self-healing just a little bit, right? Just a little bit across the board on all the tanks, except for maybe Dark Knight, to increase the reliance on healers in more casual content, I think that you'd see a huge benefit for these jobs. This might be a hot take. I would love to see Rampart be removed and for it to be replaced on each job with a separate thematic cooldown. I just think that Rampart is boring. Maybe just make Rampart Paladin only again, because it makes sense for them. It's a thematic Paladin thing, and then give the other 3 their own version, just a little bit more unique. And give it a way to lean into their identities more, right, with another cooldown. So Paladin, I think, is probably the best overall tanking kit right now, but I do think it needs some love. Again, I think that reducing survivability just slightly to make tanking a little more threatening would be great. I think cover needs to be reworked. Cover is cool when you have a use for it, but like 90% of the time it's not useful. So I don't know. Shield bash, again, it's cool when you need it for something, but like 90% of the time it's useless. So I would love to see that removed or changed or something. I think the easiest way to reduce healing on Paladin would be to maybe just crank back the self-heal on your burst phase a little bit. I think that having every single spell that you cast and configure heal you is like a little bit much. So maybe just reduce that slightly. And then, you know, Paladin has this identity right now of being like the flexible magic tank. So lean into that, you know, make it so that you can stack Divine Might. So like when you disengage, you can hammer out 3 Holy Spirits back to back or something, or make it so that Divine Might is stronger. Or, you know, if we're going to see this idea of like skill trees that is kind of being floated for 8.0, maybe make that a choice where like when I hit Royal Authority, I get 3 stacks of Divine Might, and like the individual spell casts are weaker, but I can cast 3 spells moving freely, gives me a lot more flexibility. My other choice is I get 1 stack of Divine Might and it's much more powerful, right? So again, agency, choice. Those are the things that I'm really looking for here. Warrior, I think overall is a really good kit, but again, it needs a little sauce. I think reducing self-healing is like needed here. It's a little bit too strong. It's just, it makes casual content like completely trivial, which it's casual content, whatever. But I just think that it would benefit the job as a whole, right? I would love to see Orogeny and Upheaval be condensed, kind of like Shoha and Shoha 2. I don't really know that we need to have both of them into one skill, and then have a new OGCD introduced. And it would be cool for Warrior as like their additional thing to think about, to maintain, to have another buff of some kind. You know, maybe if we reduce the amount of sustain that they have, maybe there's a new OGCD that when they press it, it gives them like a 45-second buff that increases their max HP while they're under it or something. Like a mini Thrill of Battle. And they have to like maintain it by pressing this OGCD on cooldown, right? Just like something additional to monitor, I think would be fun on Warrior. I would love to see Butcher's Block brought back. That's just a personal thing. I miss Butcher's Block. Would love to see that come back. Dark Knight. Dark Knight is probably the tank I have the most to say about, because I think it's the tank that has the most issues. Dark Knight desperately needs more interesting filler. Pressing 1, 2, 3 over and over and over again on Dark Knight is so boring. I would love to see a second combo, or at least like a second finisher, just like anything, even if it just had what Warrior has, where it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4. That would be fine, you know? Just something. It needs something. Dark Knight, I think, is the only job that needs a little bit more sustain. The 7.1 changes helped, but it could still be a little bit better. I think that, again, the same thing I said then, I think Abyssal Drain needs to be a castable spell with an MP cost that's separate from Carve and Spit. And I think that a really easy thing to do for Dark Knight, like a slam dunk, would be this, to add a second combo, and the finisher of the second combo gives you a buff that's similar to Divine Might, where you can cast Abyssal Drain for free and get a bunch of health back. That to me is like a no-brainer. And then Carve and Spit is just like its own thing, and you could make Carve and Spit deal, you know, cleave damage, sort of like Shoha does. I don't know. The fact that that hasn't been done yet is just crazy to me. TBN I still don't like. TBN is the only mitigation in the game that punishes your damage if you don't get maximum value out of it, which I think is just bad design. I think if TBN has to function the way that it currently does, where you only get a benefit if it breaks, then we probably need to remove the MP cost of it, and instead make it consume gauge, or make it consume your own HP to cast, like just something that's different than MP. Because if we're going to continue to force the damage buff of Dark Knight to be reliant on having MP to hit Flood or Edge, then having direct punishment where you get 1 less edge if your TBN doesn't break is it's just a little bit annoying. And if TBN has to cost MP, then I would like to see the damage component where it gives you a free edge or flood just happen, where that happens whether the shield expires or the shield breaks, and then you get a new benefit for the shield breaking. You know, if we have to have an MP cost on TBN, then give it a benefit that doesn't negatively affect my damage for that MP cost. I'd like to see Salted Earth get some kind of effect while I'm standing in it. Right now, it's just a dot in disguise, which is lame. You know, I think you could do really interesting stuff where, like, when you're standing in it, you gain gauge passively, or you HP regen passively, or anytime you complete a combo, it like pulses, or anytime you use a weapon skill, it pulses and deals damage, like something like that. And I'd like to see Salt and Darkness have some kind of benefit for like timing it correctly. You know, maybe like a really fun thing to do, since Dark Knight has like a lot less OGCDs than some of the other tanks, would be whenever I'm standing in Salted Earth, every time I hit a weapon skill while I'm inside of it, I get a charge of Salt and Darkness. So like between every weapon skill, I'm manually pulsing this ability and getting that extra damage out every time I use an attack. But I have to like do that. I have to manually kind of go back and forth between these buttons and get that feeling of flicking back and forth between my ground benefit and my attack benefit, right? I think that would be a really fun loop to just sort of give Dark Knight like more to do. It would make the filler more interesting as well. I think that Living Shadow is lame. Sorry, Living Shadow is just a second dot that's got a Groucho Marx mask on it to make you think it's not a dot. I think that it would be cooler to replace it with something more thematic. It'd be a great opportunity to bring back like Dark Arts to augment skills, or you know, transform the Dark Knight, like bring back Dark Side as a way to like maybe instead of summoning Frey, we Dark Side and he possesses us, right? Almost like Reaper, but like not quite as intense. And so you have this phase where you're like a Giga Tank, and like maybe, you know, it would be really crazy if we had a toggleable ability where everything happened faster, but all of our abilities cost HP, you know, or cost MP. And so like it creates this blood tank MP management feeling where, you know, maybe I hit Dark Side, I transform, everything I do costs MP, every action, like it transforms my combo buttons into new abilities, and all of those cost MP to execute. And I can choose to stay in that form, but every time I hit a button when I don't have the MP to cast it, it instead uses my HP. So I'm sacrificing my health to deal additional damage in this phase, or I can end the phase manually early so that I don't incur that HP penalty. You know, like something like that would be really interesting and give Dark Knight just a lot of identity and just make it very, very cool. So that would sort of be my, you know, Make-A-Wish idea. Gunbreaker, I think, has two big issues. Extremely high potency bloat, where we have attacks that are 1200, 1500 potency that don't auto direct crit, just sucks. It feels terrible because every time you hit that button, you're basically gambling. And gambling in a job does not feel good unless the job is built around it, right? If the job is built around gambling and trying to get these things to happen, like procs, like Dancer, then it doesn't feel bad. It just feels like the loop. But with Gunbreaker, you have this rotation that you're moving through, and then you have these buttons that you press, and you're like, here it comes, here's my damage, and then sometimes you just do 15% less damage because you got unlucky. And that just feels really bad. I don't want that. So I would lower the potency on Double Down and Lionheart combo and make them auto direct crit, or at least auto crit, you know, something. Double Down, I would also like to see it as a targeted ability. There's a lot of bosses jumping right as I press Double Down and I don't get the potency, and like, yeah, you know, skill issue, whatever. But I would just much rather see it be a targeted skill. Super Belide, after the changes, feels kind of nuts. It's basically just hollowed ground, but like better in every way now. Setting your HP to 50% like doesn't really mean anything because you're still invulnerable. You know, you're still not taking damage, and one heal from basically any healer with some gear, and you're gonna be at 100% again. So I just like to see something change there. I think that the old loop where it set you to 1 and you kind of had to react within that window to get your HP back, or you just died as soon as it ended, it was at least a little bit more interesting than it is now. So would love to see something happen there. Doesn't have to be that, but just something. All right, and last but not least is healers. I did a whole video on healers that I'll put up here, talking about how I'd like to see the job and the role change going forward. And I'm basically going to say a lot of the same stuff here because my opinion has not changed at all. I think that healers need damage combos. Every single one of them needs a damage combo. Having one button damage skills feels bad. And I think that these damage combos need to connect directly into their healing kits in interesting ways. You know, like tanks, I feel like we need to lean into the identity of each of these jobs a little more and create these opportunities for healers to actually utilize their kits as opposed to just hitting glare 27 times in a minute and only healing with OGCDs. I think that that's like antithetical to the design of a healer job, right? So how would I do that? Sage. I think the first thing for Sage is I would really love for the 2 dots, the single target and the AoE dot, to stack. During the media tour, this is how this functioned. You could stack them. And I think that that would be a really cool skill gap to have on Sage. That would differentiate between good Sages' ability to keep both of those dots up simultaneously and just okay Sages who could only keep one up. I would like to see Zoe guarantee that your next damage spell will like crit direct hit and increase the healing of Cardia, or make it so that like your next heal will guaranteed crit on the shield. Like, I would love to see Zoe do something more than just enhance the potency of something. I think a really cool way to do it would be to make the next damaging spell deal a bunch of extra damage and then increase the healing on anybody who has Cardia or Eudaimonia. That would be like a fun interaction. And it would lean into the identity of Sage is like the healer that heals through dealing damage, right? I would love for there to be a way to generate Adder Sting that doesn't require a shield interaction. You know, it's sort of my same antithesis for my same sort of feelings towards TBN. I think that generating a utility dependent on like a certain thing happening is like just not really that interesting. I'm fine with that being there, but I don't like it being the only way that it can happen, right? I think that an easy thing to do would be to have the damage combo, you know, add a 2-button damage combo, a 2 or 3-button damage combo to Sage, and at the end you generate an Adder Sting for finishing the last combo, right? So I would love to see just more identity of like dealing damage to heal allies. And I think that we could probably consolidate some of the OGCDs. I don't think that we need a single target and an AoE version of all the Cole buttons. You know, you could combine these 4 buttons into 2 skills, where one is a single target with a heal and a shield, and the other one is an AoE with a heal and a mitigation, and just have 2 buttons that function, that do the same thing as those 4 buttons do now. Just ways to prune some stuff, give them slightly less tools so that they actually have to think about when they're using them, right? White Mage, I would like to see Arrow and Stone be removed and be replaced with Banish and Dia as low-level skills. This just makes room for other jobs to use these elements, which I think is important, because eventually we're going to run into scenarios where, well, we're using the same spells. So I would like to just see them have the opportunity to use wind and stone magic somewhere else, right? Cure 1 needs to transform into Cure 2. Tier 1 is a trap. It exists solely to indicate that somebody doesn't know what they're doing. So just replace it with Tier 2. Stop letting people cast Tier 1 past level 30. It's stupid. Second charge of the dash, I think would be a great kit addition. Movement is fun. I think that would be very cool. White Mage, I think, is in a pretty good spot. I don't know that it needs a ton of changes, in my opinion. I don't know that there's a ton of things that need to happen in 8.0 for it to feel really good. I think that a good integration for them for, like, if they were to get a damage combo, like I advocate for, would be like when I finish my combo, my Lily time, you know, I get 5 seconds of gauge for that. Or like I get a stack of something, and at a certain number of stacks, I get a free Lily, or I can, like, you know, put a size on it. You know, after I get a certain number of stacks, I can use a size, like something like that. I think would be a cool function. Scholar. Scholar is probably my least played job in the entire game. I don't love Scholar. It's mostly because of the jank of the fairy. You know, I think that pet jobs generally feel bad. I think that the reason that they changed Summoner the way that they did is because they know that. The way that the fairy functions just be changed completely, right? I think it would be cool for Scholar to have more ways to utilize the fairy gauge. I think right now it's just there, you know, you utilize it for 1 or 2 skills and that's it. I think really what I'd like to see personally is for Aether Flow to be removed from Scholar, and for all of the things that cost Aether Flow to instead just be utilized by the fairy gauge. I think that right now the fairy gauge is just there. It doesn't get utilized for much, and that's just kind of doesn't feel very good to have this gauge that just kind of hangs out. But that's just me. I know that that's probably not a good opinion to have for a lot of people. You know, input eating and ghosting is still really bad on Scholar. It's gotten better over time, but it still doesn't feel great. It still feels sort of unresponsive. This could be fixed pretty easily by having the fairy function more like Queen, or like the larger summoner summons like Bahamut, where it's more of like a phase that you enter. But I understand that people might not like that, because the fairy does provide passive healing while it's deployed, but, you know, Carbuncle used to auto attack, so like I'm fine with the fairy being out, and then we sort of use the fairy gauge to enter a more elaborate state phase to sort of use more powerful spells, and then we come back to this basic fairy that is just casting simple heals. So, you know, Seraphism, basically I think like that should function more like a summoner phase, in my opinion. And you know, Scholar used to have a lot of like fun, flavorful skills like Bane and Shadow Flare and stuff like that. I'd like to see some of those come back and make their way into like a new damage combo. So I would just like to see some of that stuff come back. Astrologian, I think my biggest issue with Astrologian is that the Astrologian we have right now feels like it's a half measure, right? Like we're halfway there. We have a lot of button bloat on Astro. Having draw, play 1, 2, 3 as all different buttons feels a little weird. I'd like to see a little bit more variance in the cards. I think that before, where it was just melee damage, range damage, was too simple, and I think that Heaven's Word, where it was like you had 6 different functions that all had like extremely temporaneous and like niche uses where it was good, and you had Royal Road and Spread and all these other things. I think that that's like a little bit too much right now. So somewhere in the middle, where we have 6 cards that have 6 unique abilities, that I could see a benefit for putting it on anyone in the party, depending on the scenario, is like a great level of complexity, and isn't so complex that I have to like literally do tarot to understand it. I think that bringing back Neutral Sect and the other one, I forget what the other one is called, but this ability to switch back and forth on your aspected spells between shielding and regening, I think is really cool. I think that's a great identity for Astro to have. And I understand that, well, it's a shield healer and pure healer world now. We have this delineation. I don't care. I think that it's more important for the jobs to feel cool to play and have cool skills to use. So having the ability to swap back and forth, I think, was a really unique and really powerful thing that Astro just lost. So I'd love to see some kind of semblance of that make its return. And, you know, Astro has this identity as sort of being like the healer who predicts damage and then undoes it, right? So like Macro and Worldly Star, or Earthly Star rather, where you have these abilities that you press and then you kind of wait. And then when damage comes out, you press it again and you get this huge benefit, right? Especially with Macro. So I'd love to see this identity as like the proactive and predictive healer become deeper, a bigger part of Astro's kit, where like maybe XCOG, you know, like XCOG, like an XCOG type ability where like I put this thing on this person and once their HP drops below a certain point, boom, they get a big heal, right? Like that to me feels like an Astro ability. But it's not. So I would love to see some more stuff like that. You know, maybe like I put a spell on you, and when you take a certain amount of damage, you get like this really big shield. You know, that type of thing, this proactive, thought out, planned type of feeling is what I think Astro needs. And right now I think it just doesn't really have that, except for a couple of skills, right? So, long list, long video. I'm yapping. But, yeah, I mean, I think that we're in a pretty good place right now in terms of the jobs, like how they feel to play, I think is really good. But what we need to focus in on is this identity, this sauce, right, that I talked about, where, yes, the base burger of each job, it's a great burger. It tastes good. It's sturdy. It holds together. It doesn't fall apart in your hands. But it's just a burger, right? Right now, what we need is toppings. We need the sauce. We need some extra stuff. We need seasoning. We need just more interesting things to differentiate each burger, because you can go to a restaurant and you can order 30 burgers, and depending on what they put on them, they're all going to be a little different, right? We can have the same thing here, where we have 21, I think, burgers, but each of them can be dressed differently. Each of them can have a different sauce, a different topping, and just feel completely distinct and feel completely unique from each other, despite the fact that they all exist within the context of being jobs, right? So that's my yap. I'm going to do my best to cut this down, but thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. Disagree, agree. Tell me what you think each job should have in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.